So in this lecture, we will be discussing an important concept in microeconomics, which is called externality. Now, what is this externality? What does it mean? Now, if you remember, one of the assumptions we have made in economics till now is that whatever decision an individual makes or a firm make, the effect is on the individual or the firm. That means the consequences of one's action is always on the individual who is involved, which essentially means that all the costs are private cost, which means that if I do something, I am the individual responsible for my actions. However, in real world, things are not that simple. There are spillover effects. For example, my actions can have unintended consequences on other people. For just to give you an example, if I am driving my car and I'm playing a loud music, that can affect somebody else who is not part of the decision making. That means it can affect the pedestrians or anybody who is living in the neighborhood. So essentially, whatever actions we take as an individual, always the cost or the benefits of those actions need not be always on the individual, but there are spillover effects of that. Now, there all can be positive effects as well. For example, many of you are coming to college to study. Obviously, most of all of you will be ending up getting a very good opportunities right after graduating from Siena. But also there are public benefits of your action of coming to college, because the community you are living in suddenly becomes more educated, and that can have effect on overall communities benefits. For example, typically home prices are higher in the communities where more educated people live. So in economics, this kind of unintended consequences, both positive and negative, on somebody else as a result of somebody else's decision or action is called externality. So let's first try to define the term externality. And externalities can often be the result for the market failure. Now, what does this market failure mean? Again, we saw in the last week that market failure can be due to monopoly because it leads to less efficient or inefficient outcomes in the market. Inefficient means that means welfare as calculated by consumer surplus and producer surplus is lower than what it could have been. So let's first define externality. This is an uncompensated impact of one person's actions on the well-being of a bystander. So this is uncompensated. That means nobody is compensating for that. Now, if you're compensating for that, then the costs are internalized, or there are no uncompensated cost or benefit. Let me give you examples of this. First, there are negative externality. That means impact on the bystander is adverse. That means my actions can have negative impact on somebody else. This could be playing loud music, smoking. So all these things can have unintended consequences on somebody else. On the other hand, there's something called a positive externality. Positive externality means that my actions have positive benefits on somebody else. And a good example is this: education. Now, clearly education helps you, but it also helps the society at large. Or say using nice perfumes, right? When you use perfume, it not only makes you feel better, but it can also make other people close by to feel better. Do people pay you for that? Of course not. Okay, so these are the examples of positive externalities. Let's try to understand how it can lead to market failure. We'll start with negative externalities and how it can lead to inefficiency. So let's start with negative externalities. It's a cost to the society of producing a good. Okay, so a negative externality means that your actions, whatever you are doing, it has cost for somebody else or society at large. and often it's seen as larger than the cost to good producers. And what it means exactly is this: my action, for example, when I drive a car, obviously I'm burning fossil fuel. If I am using a gas powered car, obviously it's affecting me, the pollution that my car is creating, but at the same time it's affecting somebody who is not even closer to the car. It might be affecting some kids or somebody who has asthma or any kind of other breathing issues because of my actions. So essentially what it means that since actual cost is not borne by the person who is taking the action, so often when I drive my car, I'm not seeing the action or real cost of my action. Now, if government makes me to pay for the pollution I'm creating, which is often done through higher taxes, then what happens, that means the cost of my action increases. We all know when cost goes up, we tend to use less of the product. So what we are going to define here is that something called the social cost. Okay, social cost is nothing but the private cost, which is the cost to the individual plus the cost to the bystanders. That means cost to the society at large. Uh, so there are two costs. One is like the cost to me because I have to pay. In the case of using a gasoline powered car, I have to use uh, uh, money to buy gas, but at the same time, if I'm made to pay for the harm that I'm causing to people who are not responsible for my driving the car, that would be part of the public cost, and buying the gas is the private cost. And often in negative externalities, social cost curve is always above the supply curve. Now you might be getting confused, why supply curve? Now supply curve, just remember for the sake of repetition, supply curve is also cost curve, or specifically marginal cost curve of the firm. Now, I'm not going to get into details why supply curve is the marginal cost curve. Just take it on face value right now. So whenever you see a supply curve right now, you can imagine it's a private cost curve or private marginal cost curve. And also this supply curve represents a private cost only. So let's take an example of pollution, right? So for that, first let's try to draw. We'll go back to our demand and supply. So this is, let's say, price of gasoline, and this is quantity of gasoline. Okay, and we have this demand for gasoline, and we have this supply of gasoline, and this supply represents private cost or marginal cost. Okay, just take it on face value that supply is also the marginal cost, and it's private cost because it just takes into account the actions. And as a result, what's happening here is that we are producing, say, Q star amount of gas at some price P star. That means the price P star that I am paying to consume Q star amount of gas, it only includes private cost. Now, obviously, we all know actual cost to the society for having this gasoline powered cars or use of more gasoline is much higher because there are people who might be affected, who though not intentionally but unintentionally, but they are affected. So actual cost to the society is higher. If the actual cost is higher, which essentially means that social cost which is a curve here, social cost, and social cost includes private plus public cost, or let's use external cost. Private plus external cost. In this case, negative. So what it is telling you is that actual cost is higher, so somebody should be paying a higher price. And when it's a higher price, somebody should be producing less of it. So this is more efficient outcome because it takes into account all the costs that involve both internal or private cost plus external cost. But what about this equilibrium? This is your free market equilibrium. Now, what is this as free market equilibrium? Because this is based on if nobody intervenes in the market. But in reality, so this is the reality, right? But what is unintended consequences is at this point. So as a society, we should be trying to hit this ideal efficient outcome, which means that less of gasoline, and only way you can make people to use less of gasoline if they have to pay the actual price, which is P1 and not P star. Now this is a case of negative externality because it's affecting somebody adversely. We can have a case of positive externality. Now let's give you an example of positive externality, which is education. As I said, your education can benefit somebody else. So in this case, social value is the demand, and so social value of the demand, which is a demand curve which is higher than the private value. So social value curve is above the demand curve. Now it becomes clearer when we'll talk about as an example. So let's say positive externality. So again, we'll draw a, let's say, price of education, which could be tuition dollars you are paying, and quantity of education. Now there is a supply of education, and there's a and this is a private benefit. Okay, this demand is measuring the private benefit, which means somebody is paying a price, say P star, and again you are getting Q star of education. However, we all know there is a positive benefits associated with education. As we know, as I said earlier, education can lead to lower crime rate. Obviously, it's simply because you are educated, you tend to have lower crime rate. That means it affects somebody else less. Now, obviously, society wants to have more of education because more education means better off society. Obviously, the benefit that society is getting is much higher, and demand measures the benefit. So actual social benefit would be somewhere here. This is the social value, which includes private plus external benefits. So in this society, we are demanding to produce Q1 amount of education. That means the society is demanding higher education. But From market perspective, free market perspective, this is the equilibrium. But from society's perspective, this is a socially optimum equilibrium. So we want to hit this point at a socially optimal equilibrium. So essentially, we want more of education, more people to get educated, because it can lead to lower other lower the or it can increase benefit to other people in the society. So essentially what's happening, what are the outcome externalities? For the negative externalities, market produce larger quantity than socially responsible. That means it's tend to produce more than what is we desire. On the other hand, in positive externalities, market produce smaller quantity than that is socially desirable. So somehow market is not functioning well, because with negative externalities, we're producing too much, and often the main users of those or producers of those unwanted things are not bearing the actual cost, and that's why they are producing more. In the case of positive externality, we are actually producing less of some things, but society desires to be producing more. But why somebody is not willing to produce more if it is good? Simply because that person is not compensated for or encouraged to produce more. So somehow those people needs to be encouraged. So what are the public policy, what we can do to encourage? One is command and control policies like regulations. Generally it's used in case of negative externalities. For example, certain kind of chemicals are banned completely in US because they are so dangerous, and that's why it should not be used at all, no matter what the cost is. Or sometimes we can take a market-based policies. Now, good example of market-based policies are taxes on negative externalities, right? For example, cigarettes are taxed higher simply because we know there are side effects of cigarettes, and since there are side effects of cigarettes, we want to reduce the consumption of cigarettes. One way you can do, you can just increase the price of the cigarettes by imposing taxes. So if you want to decrease the use of something, you can impose taxes. So in the market-based policies for negative externalities, we use taxes. On the other hand, for positive externalities, we use something called subsidy. That means we give money from the society to individuals to do something more which is beneficial for people at large. Again, a good example is your subsidized student loan. Why do you think society is subsidizing your student loan? Because society understands that if you go to college and if you get educated, that's not only going to benefit you, but benefit people at large. So it is the responsibility of the people at large to pay you so that you are encouraged to go to college, which is done by reducing your cost of education. And that's the idea behind the market-based policies. Now, generally in US, we follow more market-based policies, but regulations are also important, because in certain cases, you simply can't have market-based policies. And one good example is nowadays a discussion about the gun laws. Despite the fact that I don't know if guns are taxed, even if you impose a lot of taxes, still perhaps people having too many guns is detrimental to the society's outcome. In this case, perhaps what we require is a regulations where certain kind of guns cannot be used or cannot be purchased by public at large. Again, these are perhaps more political topics, but the often ideas behind and how it could be controlled, can answers could be found in the world of economics.